It was a chilly November morning in London, 1983. Fog rolled in, shrouding the city in a thin layer of mystery as people went about their daily routines, unaware that their perception of security was about to be shattered. At the Heathrow International Trading Estate, 6 men with nerves of steel and plans as solid as gold prepared to execute one of the most notorious heists in British history, the Brink's-Mat robbery. They weren't just going after money, they were looking for gold, cold, and pure. A treasure worth millions that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. But this wasn't a story of masked villains storming in without a plan. No, this heist was precise, planned by minds that craved the thrill of danger and had the skills to match. And at the center of it all was Brian Robinson. Robinson, a man who seemed on the surface to be an average Londoner, had something far darker in his heart. A need for more. A hunger that would drive him to orchestrate a crime that would go down in history. This was not just a heist. It was a statement. Born into a working-class family, Robinson grew up amidst the bustling streets of London. He was the kind of kid who saw opportunity where others saw limitations. His charm, his ability to rally people behind him, were what made him the perfect leader for what he called the ultimate job. A man who never accepted the cards he was dealt, Robinson knew he was destined for more, and by more, he meant millions. This was the man who would, in just one moment, transform from a frustrated dreamer into the mastermind of one of Britain's biggest crimes. To understand the significance of the Brink's-Mat robbery, we need to understand the kind of man Robinson was. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a craftsman of chaos, an individual who knew that life was nothing more than a game where the stakes could be manipulated and the rules rewritten. This robbery was not his first dance with crime, but it was the one that could catapult him to the big leagues, where gold and diamonds glittered just beyond the reach of the law. Brian Robinson was known in certain circles as someone who could make things happen. He wasn't afraid of risk. In fact, he thrived on it. There was an allure to the forbidden, an almost magnetic pull that drew him towards a life of crime. He was persuasive, and his connections were impeccable. He knew just whom to bring in, just how to twist their weaknesses into a shared desire for the unimaginable riches that awaited them in the high-security vault at Heathrow. And he knew that this heist would be one that people would remember forever. On November 26, 1983, Robinson, along with his trusted crew, approached the Brink's-Mat depot under the guise of legitimate business. It was meant to be an ordinary day, and the staff had no idea what was coming. With chilling precision, the men moved, quickly subduing the guards, taking control and placing a closed sign at the entrance to keep potential witnesses away. Inside the vault lay their prize, £26 million in gold bullion, diamonds, and cash, a haul that in today's terms would be worth approximately £111 million. A haul so significant that it would change the face of organized crime in Britain forever. But for Brian, this wasn't just about the money. This was about power, about proving himself to the world, to his accomplices, and most importantly, to himself. Robinson thrived on that fine line between thrill and terror, the moment when anything could go wrong but somehow didn't. His mind was a labyrinth of ambition, a place where plans and backup plans intersected seamlessly, and this heist was his masterpiece. As the crew worked, there were no mistakes, no fumbles, just cold efficiency. They drilled through the safety deposit boxes, working with speed and precision. In that vault, time seemed to stand still, the only sound the steady rhythm of drills and the occasional muted cheer as yet another box gave way to reveal its treasure. This was Robinson's art. This was his symphony. He was in control, orchestrating every movement, every decision with flawless precision. The heist itself seemed to be unfolding without a hitch, a near-impossible feat. But in the world of crime, there's always an unforeseen twist, always a loose end that can unravel the entire plan. Robinson knew this, but he didn't let the fear show, not to his crew, and certainly not to himself. He held his nerve as the minutes turned into hours, and as they finally began packing their haul and preparing to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. He was about to pull off the heist of a lifetime, and yet somewhere deep down he knew it wasn't over. The biggest heist in Britain's history couldn't possibly end so neatly, so perfectly. The gold, the diamonds, the cash. It all came at a price. The question that loomed over Robinson was simple. How long could they enjoy their spoils before the world caught up to them? As the gang made their escape, the seed of doubt had already been planted. They had just pulled off the impossible, but now they had to deal with the repercussions. For Robinson, this was only the beginning. The thrill, the high, it was undeniable. But he knew that a storm was brewing, that their actions on that cold November morning would leave behind traces, echoes that the authorities would follow. Would they get away with it, or was this just the calm before the storm? As they drove away from the scene, gold in tow, the weight of what they had done began to sink in. The greatest heist Britain had ever seen was in motion, and the fallout was about to begin. So what exactly happened next? How did a group of men with a plan, the right tools, and a lot of nerve end up caught in the crosshairs of one of the biggest manhunts in British history? We'll need to dive deeper into the minds of those who made it happen, into their motivations, their fears, and the bond that held them together, even as everything around them threatened to come undone. This is where the story of Brian Robinson really starts to get interesting. But for now, I want to know, what do you think? How do you feel about someone like Brian Robinson, a man who was willing to risk everything, not just for the money, but for the thrill, the adrenaline, the sheer audacity of it all? Would you say he was a criminal mastermind, or simply a man who let his ambitions lead him too far? The idea of stealing millions in gold bullion and cash wasn't conceived overnight. The Brinksmat robbery was the culmination of months of careful planning, scheming, and strategizing. It all started with Brian Robinson, a man whose ambitions reached far beyond the ordinary. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a team, and more importantly, he needed inside information. To pull off something of this magnitude, every detail had to be calculated with precision, and that's where Anthony Black came into play. Anthony Black was a security guard at the Brinksmat depot, and, coincidentally, Brian Robinson's brother-in-law. Black was a man who felt life had cheated him, a low-paid worker guarding unimaginable wealth with no hope of ever touching it. It didn't take much persuasion from Robinson to get Black on board. Robinson had a way of making his plans sound foolproof, a way of making the impossible seem within reach. For Black, it was an opportunity too tempting to resist, a chance to turn his life around with one swift move. Then there was Mickey McAvoy, Robinson's right-hand man and trusted confidant. McAvoy had a reputation in the underworld, a reputation for getting things done, no matter the risks involved. Together, Robinson and McAvoy were a formidable duo, each feeding off the other's audacity. They began assembling a team, a group of men who were no strangers to the world of crime. They needed experts in breaking and entering, men who could handle the pressure, men who would not buckle when faced with the weight of 26 million pounds in gold. The weeks leading up to the heist were intense. Robinson and McAvoy meticulously planned every detail, from the entry points to the escape route. They studied the security protocols at the depot, the shift changes, the guard rotations. Anthony Black provided them with insider information, knowledge of when the depot would be most vulnerable, when the least amount of staff would be on duty. They mapped out the entire operation, rehearsing it over and over in their minds until it became second nature. On the morning of November 26, 1983, the plan was finally set into motion. The men gathered in a safe house on the outskirts of London. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of excitement and fear. Robinson, ever the charismatic leader, gave one final briefing. He spoke with confidence, his voice steady, his demeanor calm. He knew that in moments like these, any sign of hesitation could spread like wildfire through the group. They needed to believe in the plan, and more importantly, they needed to believe in him. The men loaded into 2 vehicles, their hearts pounding as they approached the Brinksmat depot. Anthony Black was already inside, waiting for the signal. He had ensured that the security systems were at their weakest, that the guards were complacent. The heist was set to begin. As they arrived at the depot, Robinson and McAvoy, along with their accomplices, donned their disguises, balaclavas and gloves. They approached the entrance with purpose, their weapons concealed, but ready. Black opened the door, his face betraying no emotion as he let them in. The trust between him and Robinson was palpable. Black knew that once they were inside, there was no turning back. The gang moved swiftly, overpowering the guards with a mixture of threats and brute force. Robinson placed a closed sign on the main entrance to ensure that no unsuspecting visitors would interrupt their operation. Inside, the men worked with cold efficiency, forcing the staff to deactivate alarms and lead them to the vault. The tension was electric. One wrong move, one mistake, and the entire plan could fall apart. But Robinson was in control. His voice was calm, his instructions clear. He had planned for this moment, and now it was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. Once inside the vault, the men's eyes widened at the sight before them. Stacks of gold bullion, neatly arranged, glittered under the dim light. There were boxes filled with cash, bags of diamonds, a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. This was it. This was the moment they had been working towards, the moment that would change their lives forever. Robinson and his team began loading the gold into their bags, working with speed and precision. They knew they had limited time before someone realized something was wrong. The men drilled into the safety deposit boxes, each box opening to reveal more treasure. It was a surreal experience, a moment where their criminal aspirations were coming true. They had done it. They had broken into one of the most secure vaults in London, and they were walking away with millions. Outside, the city continued with its regular hum. People going to work, catching flights, unaware of the audacious crime happening right under their noses. Heathrow Airport, a symbol of security and international connection, was now the backdrop to one of Britain's biggest heists. The irony wasn't lost on Robinson. He knew that while planes were taking off, carrying people to new destinations, he and his crew were about to embark on a journey of their own, one filled with wealth, danger, and the constant threat of being caught. As the heist progressed, Robinson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had orchestrated the impossible, and it was all happening without a hitch. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling, a sense that perhaps it was all too perfect, that maybe they had overlooked something. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. There would be time for doubt later, but for now they needed to get out, gold in hand and nerves intact. As they packed the last of the bullion, Robinson gave the signal. It was time to leave. The men moved quickly, carrying their loot out to the waiting vehicles. They were careful not to draw attention, each movement rehearsed, each step deliberate. As they drove away from the scene, there was a moment of silence in the car, a moment where the reality of what they had just done began to sink in. They had pulled off the heist of a lifetime, but now they had to face the consequences. The news of the Brinks-Mat robbery spread like wildfire. The public was in shock. 26 million pounds in gold and valuables, gone in an instant. It was a story that captured the imagination of the nation, a story of audacity, of cunning criminals who had outsmarted the system. People were both horrified and fascinated. Who were these men? How had they managed to pull off such an elaborate heist right under the nose of Heathrow Airport? The reaction from Heathrow was one of disbelief and embarrassment. This was supposed to be a secure facility, a place where valuables could be stored without fear. The fact that a group of armed men had not only infiltrated the depot but had also managed to escape with millions was a blow to their reputation. Security protocols were scrutinized and questions were asked. How could this have happened? Who was responsible for this breach? Authorities scrambled to respond, launching one of the largest manhunts in British history. The pressure was on, not just to catch the robbers, but to reassure the public that they were in control. The media frenzy only added to the chaos. Newspapers ran headlines about the crime of the century, and speculation about the identities of the robbers ran rampant. Everyone wanted to know, who were these men and how had they managed to pull off the unthinkable? But for Brian Robinson and his crew, the heist was just the beginning. The gold, the diamonds, the cash, it was all theirs. But at what cost? As they sat in their hideout, surrounded by their haul, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. They had the money, but now they were wanted men. The question that lingered was simple. How long could they keep running? How long before the law caught up to them, before the cracks in their plan began to show? And so, we leave them here, at this moment of triumph and uncertainty. They had pulled off the heist of a lifetime, but the story was far from over. The gold was theirs, but so was the weight of what they had done. What came next was a test of loyalty, of nerve, and of whether they could truly outsmart the system that was now hunting them. What do you think? Would they get away with it? Or was this just the beginning of the end for Brian Robinson and his crew? Stay with us as we delve deeper into the story of betrayal, greed, and the inevitable downfall that followed one of Britain's most infamous heists. The Brinks-Mat robbery wasn't the work of just one man. It was the result of careful planning driven by greed and fueled by the skills of several dangerous individuals. As we peel back the layers of this audacious crime, we realize that each member of the gang brought something unique to the table. Brian Robinson may have been the mastermind, but he couldn't have done it alone. Every piece of the puzzle had to fit perfectly, and that's where the others came in. Mickey McAvoy, Anthony Black, Kenneth Noy, and John Palmer. Together they formed a team that was as ruthless as it was cunning. It started as a whisper, a seemingly far-fetched idea tossed around among men who felt the world owed them more than it had given. For Brian Robinson, the dream of a big score was not just about the money. It was about power, about beating a system that had always kept him and those like him on the fringes. But he knew that to make the dream a reality, he needed others who shared his ambition. He needed men who were just as hungry, just as willing to risk everything for a shot at untold riches. Mickey McAvoy was the first person Robinson turned to. Mickey was known on the streets as the Muscle, a man whose physical presence could intimidate even the bravest. But McAvoy wasn't just muscle. He had a sharp mind, a tactical way of thinking that made him invaluable. Robinson and McAvoy had been partners before, working together on smaller heists, but this was different. This was the big one, the heist that would either make them or break them. The two men began meeting in secret, discussing the logistics of the heist, dreaming about the gold, the diamonds, the stacks of cash that lay within the vaults of Brinks-Mat. They knew they would need inside information, something that would give them an edge, something that would make the impossible possible. That's when Robinson turned to his brother-in-law, Anthony Black. Anthony Black was a man who had always lived in the shadows, never quite fitting in. He was a security guard at the Brinks-Mat depot, a lowly position that put him on the front lines of a fortress of wealth. For Black, every day was a reminder of what he couldn't have. He would stand there, watching shipments of gold come and go, knowing that just beyond his reach lay enough wealth to change his life forever. When Robinson approached him with the idea, Black didn't take much convincing. The temptation was too great, the lure of escaping his mundane existence too powerful. He knew every detail about the depot, the security protocols, the guard schedules, the layout of the vault. He was the key to getting inside, and he knew it. But even with Black's insider knowledge, Robinson and McAvoy knew they needed more. They needed someone who could handle the gold, someone who could help them launder it once it was out. Kenneth Noy was the man for the job. Noy was not your typical gangster. He was sophisticated, well-connected, and had a deep understanding of how to move money through channels that would make it untraceable. He had been involved in various criminal enterprises, always staying just out of reach of the law. For Noy, the Brinks-Mat heist was a chance to prove his skills, to show that he could handle the biggest score of his career. And then there was John Palmer, known to some as Goldfinger. Palmer was a businessman on the surface, but his real business was far from legitimate. He was known for his expertise in smelting gold, for taking stolen bullion and turning it into something that could be sold without raising suspicion. Palmer was the final piece of the puzzle, the man who would ensure that the gold they stole would never be traced back to them. The meetings were held in secret locations, dingy backrooms, basements, places where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the tension was palpable. Each man brought his own perspective, his own ideas about how to make the heist work. The planning sessions were intense, with every detail scrutinized, every potential problem dissected. They knew they had to be perfect. One mistake, and they would all be looking at a lifetime behind bars. Robinson was the leader, the man who held it all together. He was calm under pressure, always thinking 2 steps ahead. He knew how to manage the different personalities in the group, how to keep them focused on the goal. McAvoy, with his imposing presence, was the enforcer, the one who kept everyone in line. He had a short temper, but Robinson knew how to keep him in check. Anthony Black was nervous, constantly worried about what could go wrong. He knew that if they were caught, he would be the first one they would come after. But Robinson reassured him, promising that everything would go smoothly, that they had accounted for every possible scenario. Black wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him. This was his chance to break free from the life that had held him down for so long. Kenneth Noy was the strategist, the one who thought about what came after the heist. He knew that stealing the gold was only half the battle. The real challenge would be making it disappear. He had connections, people who could help move the gold, people who would ask no questions as long as the price was right. For Noy, this was a game of chess, and he was determined to stay one move ahead of the authorities. John Palmer was the wild card. He was confident, almost cocky, about his ability to smelt the gold and make it untraceable. He had done it before, and he was certain he could do it again. But there was something about Palmer that worried Robinson, an unpredictability, a sense that he might take unnecessary risks. But they needed him, and Robinson knew that without Palmer, the plan would fall apart. As the day of the heist approached, the tension within the group grew. They knew that they were about to do something that would change their lives forever. They were excited, but they were also scared. They had spent months planning, but now it was time to put that plan into action. There was no turning back. They went over the plan again and again, each man knowing his role down to the smallest detail. Robinson and McAvoy would lead the team into the depot, using Black to gain entry. Once inside, they would overpower the guards, secure the building, and make their way to the vault. Noy would handle the logistics of moving the gold once they had it, and Palmer would ensure that it was smelted and sold without a trace. The night before the heist, Robinson gathered the men for one final meeting. He looked each of them in the eye, making sure they were ready. He spoke with conviction, reminding them why they were doing this, reminding them of the life that awaited them once it was all over. They had come too far to back out now. As they left that night, there was a sense of inevitability among them. They knew that what they were about to do would go down in history. They were about to take on a fortress of wealth to steal millions in gold bullion, diamonds, and cash, and they were ready. The morning of November 26, 1983, was cold and foggy, a typical London morning. The men arrived at the depot, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. Anthony Black was already inside, his nerves on edge as he watched the clock, waiting for the moment when he would let them in. He knew that once he opened that door, there was no going back. Robinson and McAvoy approached the entrance, their faces obscured by balaclavas, their guns hidden beneath their coats. Black opened the door, his hands trembling as he let them in. The others followed, moving quickly and with purpose. There was no time for hesitation. The guards were taken by surprise, overpowered before they could react. Robinson's voice was calm, his instructions clear. He knew that they had only minutes to secure the building before someone realized what was happening. McAvoy stood watch, his eyes scanning the room, ready to react to any threat. Once inside the vault, the men worked with a sense of urgency. The gold, the cash, the diamonds, it was all there, just as they had imagined. They loaded the bags, their hands moving quickly, their eyes darting nervously to the door. They knew they had limited time, and they worked with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in their minds. As they left the depot, the adrenaline was coursing through their veins. They had done it. They had pulled off the heist of a lifetime. But as they drove away, the reality of what they had just done began to sink in. They had the gold, but they also had the weight of what they had done. The question now was whether they could keep it, whether they could stay one step ahead of the law. And so, the story of the Brinksmat heist continued, a story of greed, betrayal, and the quest for power. The men had taken their shot, but the real challenge was just beginning. Would they be able to outsmart the system, or was their downfall inevitable? Stay tuned as we delve into the next part of the story, how the heist unraveled, the betrayal that led to their capture, and the pursuit that brought one of Britain's most notorious criminal gangs to justice. The Brinksmat robbery was audacious. It was meticulous. But as with all great crimes, it was not without its flaws. Greed and betrayal seeped into their tight-knit group, turning trust into paranoia and leaving the men vulnerable. The heist was only the beginning of a web of deception and surveillance that would eventually come crashing down around them, dragging each of the culprits back into the harsh spotlight of law and order. The pursuit that followed was relentless, a tense game of cat and mouse, and no one knew it better than Brian Robinson. For all their careful planning, the heist had left a series of loose ends, and it was only a matter of time before those would come back to haunt them. In the days and weeks following the robbery, the group dispersed, trying to avoid drawing any attention to themselves. They were rich, but they couldn't act like it. Not yet. The gold was moved to a secure location where it would eventually be melted down, but that was just the beginning of a very dangerous part of the operation. The first mistake came not from greed, but from fear. Anthony Black, the security guard whose insider knowledge had made the heist possible, began to crack under the pressure. Black had always been the weak link. He had no experience with real crime, no understanding of the consequences of his actions until they began to close in around him. Every time he heard a noise, every time he saw a police car, he imagined the worst, and it was that fear that eventually led him to make the biggest mistake of all. He talked. Under immense pressure from the police, Black broke. He knew they were closing in, and in his desperation, he made a deal to save himself. He confessed everything: his involvement, his brother-in-law Brian Robinson's role in the heist, and the identities of Mickey McAvoy and the others. It was a devastating betrayal, and it set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring them all down. With Anthony Black's confession in hand, law enforcement launched a full-scale operation to bring down the remaining members of the gang. The authorities knew they were up against hardened criminals, men who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to stay out of prison. They also knew that time was of the essence. Every day that passed meant more time for the stolen gold to disappear into the shadows, more time for the gang to cover their tracks. The police launched surveillance operations, watching the homes and hangouts of anyone linked to the heist. It was a long and grueling process, with officers spending countless hours parked in cars, staking out locations, waiting for something, anything, that would give them a break. They watched as the gang members tried to go about their lives, always careful not to draw attention to themselves. But the police were patient, and they were determined. The first major breakthrough came when they zeroed in on Kenneth Noy. Noy was known to be the man responsible for laundering the gold, and the police knew that if they could catch him in the act, they would have a solid case against him. They began monitoring his movements, tracking his every step, waiting for the moment when he would slip up. The surveillance on Noy's house was intense, with officers keeping a constant watch, taking note of everyone who entered and left the property. They were looking for any sign of the stolen gold, any indication that Noy was working to melt it down and sell it. But Noy was cautious, and for weeks, the police had nothing. Then, in January 1985, everything changed. During a stakeout at Noy's residence, Detective Constable John Fordham was lying in wait, hidden in the darkness, hoping to catch Noy red-handed. But Noy wasn't just cautious, he was also paranoid. He suspected he was being watched, and on that night, he decided to take action. Noy, armed with a knife, moved silently through the shadows of his garden. He spotted Fordham, and in a brutal confrontation, Noy fatally stabbed the officer. The scene was chaotic. Fordham fighting for his life, Noy acting out of fear and rage. By the time it was over, Detective Fordham lay dead, and Noy was left to face the consequences of his actions. The death of Detective Fordham was a turning point in the investigation. Noy claimed self-defense, stating that he believed Fordham was an intruder. In a controversial trial, Noy was acquitted of murder, but the authorities were not done with him yet. They had enough evidence to connect him to the stolen gold, and in 1986, he was convicted of conspiracy to handle the stolen bullion, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. While the police were closing in on Noy, they were also working tirelessly to track down Brian Robinson and Mickey McAvoy. Robinson, ever the strategist, had tried to lay low, but he knew the walls were closing in. He had heard about Anthony Black's confession, about the police closing in on Noy, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. The stress was unbearable. The constant fear of a knock on the door, the knowledge that his brother-in-law had betrayed him. It was enough to drive anyone to the edge. Robinson moved from place to place, trying to stay one step ahead of the authorities. He avoided his usual haunts, stayed away from friends and family, but the net was closing in. The police had his name, they had Black's testimony, and they were relentless in their pursuit. For Robinson, it was a waiting game, and he knew he was running out of time. In late 1984, the inevitable happened. The police, armed with a warrant and the evidence they needed, tracked Robinson down. The arrest was swift and brutal. Officers storming the safe house where he had been hiding, guns drawn, shouting orders. Robinson didn't resist. He knew it was over. As they placed the handcuffs on him, he felt a strange sense of relief. The chase was over, the fear, the constant running, it was done. But with that relief came the crushing weight of reality. He was facing a lifetime behind bars, and there was no escaping it. For Brian Robinson, those final days on the run were some of the darkest of his life. He had always prided himself on being a planner, on being the man who could see 2 steps ahead, but now he was lost. He had miscalculated. He had trusted the wrong people, and now he was paying the price. As he sat in the back of the police car, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The heist, the gold, the dreams of a life of luxury. It was all gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of what he had done. He thought about the others, about Mickey McAvoy, who was also on the run, about Kenneth Noy, who had killed a man, about Anthony Black, whose fear had brought them all down. He thought about the gold, most of which was still out there, hidden waiting to be found. It was supposed to have been their ticket to a better life, but now it was nothing more than a curse, a weight that had dragged them all down. As the car pulled into the station, Robinson took a deep breath. He knew what was coming, the interrogations, the trial, the long years in prison. He knew he would never see the gold again, never live the life he had dreamed of. But there was one thing he didn't know, whether it had all been worth it. As they led him into the station, the flash of cameras blinding him, he couldn't help but wonder if, in the end, the heist had been nothing more than a fool's dream, a fantasy that had led them all to ruin. Mickey McAvoy was the last major player to be captured. Like Robinson, he had tried to stay ahead of the police, but the net was tightening. The authorities had been following leads, tracking down anyone who might have had contact with McAvoy. And in early 1985, they finally caught up with him. McAvoy was arrested without incident, brought in to face the charges that had been piling up against him. McAvoy, the man who had once been the muscle behind the operation, now found himself powerless, at the mercy of a system that was determined to make an example of him. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming, and like Robinson, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The dream was over, and all that was left was the cold reality of a prison cell. The arrests of Robinson, McAvoy, Noy, and the others marked the beginning of the end for the Brinks-Matt gang. The heist, that had once seemed so perfect, had fallen apart, brought down by betrayal, by fear, by the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. The gold was gone, the men who had stolen it were behind bars, and the world moved on. But the story of the Brinks-Matt heist was far from over. The gold was still out there, hidden away, a symbol of the greed and ambition that had driven the men to risk everything. And as the trials came to an end, as the sentences were handed down, one question remained. Would the gold ever be found, or would it remain a ghost haunting those who had dared to steal it? Stay tuned as we delve into the final chapter of the Brinks-Matt heist, the trial, the sentencing, and the legacy of one of Britain's most notorious robberies. What happened to the stolen gold? And what were the long-term consequences for those involved? The answers may surprise you. The pursuit of unimaginable wealth ultimately came at a steep cost for Brian Robinson, Mickey McAvoy, and their accomplices. The golden dream had transformed into a chain of betrayals, harsh prison sentences, and regrets. Brian Robinson and Mickey McAvoy, the masterminds behind the Brinks-Matt heist, faced the full weight of justice. In December 1984, Both men received 25-year prison sentences. Their elaborate plan, which had seemed flawless, ended in a stark courtroom where their ambitions were shattered. They went from aspiring millionaires to prisoners, a grim fate that highlighted the unforgiving nature of crime. Anthony Black, the Brinks Mat security guard and Robinson's brother-in-law, was the inside man who made the heist possible. Under mounting pressure from law enforcement, Black broke down and revealed the names of those involved, ensuring his accomplices' arrests. Black received a 6-year prison sentence for his role. His betrayal, necessary for the prosecution's case, made him the weak link in the operation. Kenneth Noy, tasked with laundering the stolen gold, played a dangerous game. He melted down the bullion, trying to erase any trace of its origins. But his involvement led to intense police surveillance. In January 1985, during a police stakeout, Noy fatally stabbed Detective Constable John Fordham. Noy claimed self-defense and was acquitted of murder. However, in 1986, he was convicted of conspiracy to handle the stolen gold and sentenced to 14 years in prison. John Palmer, known as Goldfinger, assisted Noy in laundering the gold. Despite the evidence against him, Palmer was acquitted in 1987, as the jury found insufficient proof that he knew the gold was linked to the heist. Palmer walked free, a controversial outcome that left many questioning the justice system. The Brinks Mat robbery's impact extended far beyond the heist itself. The majority of the stolen gold was never recovered, believed to be smelted and sold. The robbery financed other criminal enterprises and fueled the rise of organized crime across the UK in the 1980s and 1990s. The violence and betrayals that followed the heist left a bloody trail. People involved either ended up dead or in prison. For law enforcement, the Brinks Mat robbery was a wake-up call. It exposed vulnerabilities in security practices and led to significant changes in law enforcement tactics against organized crime. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, and infiltration became critical tools in fighting sophisticated criminal enterprises. The Brinks Mat heist was more than just a robbery. It was a lesson in the high cost of greed. The men who dreamed of riches ended up imprisoned or betrayed, and their story remains a cautionary tale about the consequences of crime. The gold they sought was never worth the price they paid, and the heist's legacy lives on as a reminder of the heavy hand of justice. The Brinks Mat heist may have promised riches, but it ultimately delivered only ruin. It serves as a timeless reminder of the human cost of crime, a cost that no one involved could afford to pay. Stay tuned as we continue exploring tales of ambition, betrayal, and justice. The Brinks Mat heist was just one chapter in the saga of organized crime, and there are many more stories yet to be told.